Hello, and welcome to our lecture for Chapter 2, Drug Use as a Social Problem, for our online section of PBH435. I'd like to give you a quick preview of the material we're going to be covering in today's lecture. We're going to start by talking about some different kinds of drug-related toxicity, both acute and chronic toxicity, and then the difference between physiological and behavioral toxicity. We're also going to spend some time talking about data, and that'll be coming from the DAWN system and how that relates to emergency room data on drug use. We're also going to be talking about some important vocabulary words: tolerance, physical dependence, and behavioral dependence. And then a little bit more on vocabulary, the important distinctions between substance abuse disorder and substance dependence disorder and how those are diagnosed. Then we're going to dig into a little bit on some current theories on the causes of dependence, and then wrap up with some discussion of drug use and crime here in our lecture on drug use as a social problem. When we talk about the problems that are related to consuming drugs, we can break those into two really broad categories. The first one is problems that are related to taking the drug. These are physical problems that result from consuming the substance. So it may be the risk of developing dependence, or it could be risks that come with taking too much of a particular substance. The health risks of consuming cocaine, or the risk of alcohol suppressing respiration to the point where a person stops breathing. Now, there's another major category of problems related to drug use that are related to the fact that we consider it a deviant behavior. Here we're talking about legal consequences such as getting arrested or fined, and then also the expenses that go with trying to prevent drug use and treat drug use here in our society. So we've got these two really broad categories. Now, when we look at the way that we handle drugs legally here in the United States, we see a really broad and widely scoped change that occurred in the 1800s. So before this change occurred, the United States had a very laissez-faire approach to drug use and drug restriction. Laissez-faire basically kind of means hands-off, let it be. So drugs were produced, manufactured, consumed, all without legal consequences or legal standards for those processes. The photo here for cocaine tooth drops. You can imagine, if you can imagine seeing that in Rite Aid or CVS these days, you can see that's it's a great example of how those rules and regulations have changed here in the U.S. So before these laws started to change, you could produce a drug in your backyard. You could make cocaine tooth drops, you could make heroin nerve tonic, and if you put it in a bottle and put a label on it and sold it, there's nothing illegal or against the law about what you were doing. Even if you made claims about your cocaine tooth drops or your heroin nerve tonic that were untrue, these were not against the law. Now, if your medication was toxic, then people probably would stop buying it. And if your medication didn't do what you said it was going to do, there's a chance they might stop buying it as well. But there really were no legal standards or legal restrictions on you coming up with something like that. Or selling something that we now consider a controlled substance. So when we think about why those rules started to change to our current environment with all of the legal requirements and restrictions around those processes, they kind of focus around these three main concerns: toxicity, dependence, and crime. So drugs were likely to become regulated if they were dangerous. They were likely to become regulated if they led to dependence among regular users, and they were also likely to become regulated if people perceived a risk of crime among the people who use them. So in all these broad categories, we can see drugs that used to be unregulated becoming regulated in the U.S. during that time period. Now, when we talk about toxic drugs, drug-related toxicity, we're going to start by defining toxic. It's something that we use pretty loosely in our society, whether it's for song lyrics, or we're going to do some kind of cleanse to clear toxins out of our body. But the definition here is a toxic substance is one that's poisonous, deadly, or dangerous, and that's the way we'll use it here in class. So when we talk about toxicity, we can break these into broad categories. we've got physiological versus behavioral toxicity. These are things, dangerous behaviors that occur in the behavior category related to taking the drug, or the actual physical effects of the drug on the body in the physiological category. And then we've also got acute versus chronic toxicity. Substances can cause different effects in your body and in your life if you consume them at the time that you're consuming them, which is the acute toxicity, versus the results of consuming them over the long term, which is that chronic toxicity. Now, when we talk about physiological toxicity, we're talking about the immediate changes in the body, and these can be acute or chronic. So an acutely toxic effect of consuming prescription painkillers could be that they suppress respiration to the point where the user stops breathing. Now, chronic physiological toxicity, this is long-term exposure to the drug, long-term introduction of the substance into the body. And here in the image we have the effects of chronic exposure to alcohol in a liver. This is cirrhosis, chronic physiological toxicity from consuming alcohol. These might include other effects like high blood pressure, heart disease, lung cancer from smoking cigarettes. So these physiological toxicities can be either acute or chronic, but they are directly related to the physical consumption of the substance. Now, when we talk about behavioral toxicity, these consequences can also be acute or chronic. If we think about the example of alcohol consumption, one acute behavioral toxicity from alcohol consumption might be DUI, or a car accident caused from driving under the influence. So this dangerously impairs your behavioral functioning, but it's happening in the moment. It has to do with you consuming the alcohol at that particular moment in time. Now, chronic behavioral toxicity, these are the effects of continuing to consume that substance over a long period of time. It might affect your ability to stay employed, it might affect your interpersonal relationships. You can see lots of ways where the chronic consumption of a substance, of a dangerous drug, could result in that behavioral toxicity. So again, we have that breakdown between the immediate effects of consuming the substance versus the long-term effects of consuming that substance over time. Now, we talked about a couple of other data sources in our previous lecture. Today we're going to talk about the Drug Abuse Warning Network, or DAWN. This is a source of data that we use for information about acute toxicity of drug consumption. Basically, emergency rooms in hospitals in cities around the United States, not all hospitals, but a sample of hospitals, collect data on drug-related ER visits. What DAWN collects is information on illicit drugs like heroin and cocaine, but also misuse of legal prescription and over-the-counter drugs. Now, what it doesn't determine is whether or not the drugs caused the ER visit. So if you're driving your car and you have a car crash for another reason, but you get to the emergency room and your blood test indicates that you were consuming cocaine, your data gets reported. Now, we're not trying to determine whether the cocaine caused your car crash or not, just that you came into the emergency room and that you had that positive blood test for cocaine use. So when we look at what we find out from DAWN, we find out that our single biggest reason for emergency room visits related to substance consumption is alcohol in combination with another drug. Now, we are looking only at illicit drug use, and the fact is that if we looked at alcohol-related visits only, all of these other statistics would be dwarfed in comparison. But because we're looking at illicit drug use, alcohol is still our number one, but it's illicit, so we're looking at alcohol in combination with other drugs. And then we move through some of the other ones that you might expect: cocaine, prescription opioids. These are our prescription painkillers that we just discussed. Marijuana, heroin, they all make our top 10 list here. But again, if we think about the impact of alcohol, legal consumption of alcohol, again, these all look like a rounding error if we compare it to that. So, DAWN doesn't really tell us how dangerous a drug is. We're really just reporting the number of mentions in total ER visits. It doesn't tell us how dangerous the drug is in comparison to the number of people who are using it. And again, it doesn't really tell us the cause of why the person was there. If you consume marijuana the night before and you're on a ladder hanging Christmas lights, you fall off the ladder, you go to the emergency room, you test positive for marijuana, then that is going to be listed as that will be reported through DAWN as an ER visit related to illicit substance consumption. So you can see how this, again, as a source of data isn't perfect, although it's another way that we try to approach this problem, another way to try and report data on this, this behavior of drug consumption here in the United States.